This happened in my hometown when I was 7. The year would have been 1988. For context, I lived on an island off the coast of Washington State in a military town that is among one of the safest places to live in the US. However, weirdos are everywhere. The time of year this took place is vague for me, but since I was outside playing with my friends, I'm guessing it was a summer evening, just before dinner time. We were screwing around riding our bikes in the street, playing tag. You know, the usual stuff that kids got up to during the 1980s. That's when a car pulled up and stopped in the middle of the street. I don't remember the make or model of the car, or what exactly the driver said to me, but he must have somehow got me over there, because I do remember that I walked close enough to hear what he said. He asked me if I had seen any other kids wandering around, because one of his kids were missing. I then noticed that there was also a woman in the car with him, so I assumed she was the mother, and he was the father. I said no, I hadn't seen any other kids wandering around, but that there was a park nearby around the corner, and he might have been able to find them there. As a side note, I was super proud of myself for thinking of this at 7. The man then asked if I would be willing to get in the car and show them where the park was. Although I didn't fully understand just how dangerous this was, I was still aware of the whole stranger danger thing, so I declined. He kept insisting that I get in the car. Again, I said no, but gave him directions to the park. I then skipped off and continued playing with my friends, who had been standing there watching the whole time. The car slowly pulled away. A few minutes later, my mom came outside to call me in for dinner, and I bounced happily up the driveway to tell her that I had helped someone. I was very excited to have done this for an adult. I then explained the whole thing to my mother. Her face changed a bit, but she nervously said, "That's very nice of you, hon." I then felt a surge of pride. Eventually, my dad came home. He was a solid Navy dude. He was a black belt, used to be in pararescue, the kind of badass Chuck Norris checks under his bed for every night. My mother obviously told him what happened. His reaction was much different. He told me that although he was proud that I liked to help people, but that I was never ever to approach anyone I didn't know like that again. He said, "Remember, adults should never be asking children for help like that." I never forgot his words, and have since passed this wisdom down to my own daughter. He then told me that I was lucky that I hadn't gotten snatched, and to always remember it, because they would have lost me forever if things had gone differently. He was very stern with me, which did hurt my ego a little bit. After 30 years of getting to know my father better, he only gets stern because that is his reaction when he gets scared. Poor guy. Years before this, I had escaped as a toddler and was found on a cliff in Japan. And then I left the yard another time in San Antonio to try and go sell my coloring book pages door to door. I'm sure he was wondering what fresh hell he was in with a kid like me. I'm unaware if my parents ever did anything with that information, but it's almost 100% likely they did tell someone, because they are solid, loving folks. But as far as I'm aware, nothing ever came of it. And I'm not sure if something like this happened in my town again. Growing up, I lived in a decent-sized, middle-class apartment complex. The year this happened was 1988. I would say I was about 5. Since there was only one driveway in and out of the complex, my mother pretty much allowed me to roam around by myself from a very young age. My block of apartments was the first one you passed when you entered the complex, and my apartment was about 100 feet from the main entrance. I wasn't supposed to leave the block, unless my mom knew where I was going. I was a very curious and precocious child, and was very social. My mom used to call me the mayor, because I knew who a good number of people in the apartment complex were. I've had a few run-ins with creeps and weirdos during my time there, but nothing that ever escalated into a dangerous situation. My parents were both pretty tough growing up, and educated me early on about street smarts and self-defense, and that sometimes it was okay to speak to strangers in certain situations, because not everyone is bad, but they also taught me how to tell when someone might be dangerous. We had at one point an especially creepy ice cream man. He had a Billy Ray Cyrus type spiky mullet. He always wore a tank top and had really bad acne. He also had very strangely arranged teeth and a piggish nose. At the time, I considered him to be in his 40s, but looking back, he was probably in his late teens, early 20s. He loved talking to the other kids about wrestling. That was really big back then. I walked up to his truck once, along with my friends, when he was parked outside of the pool. I didn't have enough money for something, so I said, "Never mind, I don't have enough." But he gave it to me anyway for whatever amount of money I did have. It seemed nice, but I didn't like the way he smiled at me. It was very unnerving. So if I ever heard that ice cream truck theme playing outside, I would peek out the window to see which ice cream guy was pulling into the complex. If it wasn't him, I would go and get ice cream. If it was, I would stay inside. I don't know how much time passed between my first encounter with him and the last, but in between, there was a few occasions where I was coming home or going to a different section of the apartment complex for whatever reason, and if I happened to be walking down the main drive, he would pull up next to me on the sidewalk, and I would just pretend he wasn't there and cut through the court and hide. He would say things to me like, "Why are you so scared of me? I'm a nice guy. You make me feel bad." One day, my mom said I couldn't leave the block for whatever reason. My friend lived in the corner apartment of the block next to mine, so I sat on my court's corner nearest hers, and she sat on her corner. She wasn't allowed to go into my court either, it seemed, so we were just talking and tossing toys to each other when I heard the ice cream truck approaching. Even though I was at the other end of my block, he saw me when he pulled in. He started driving towards me, and I just ran and hid in my court until he moved further into the complex. I waited what felt like a long enough time. I could no longer hear the music anymore. I walked back to the corner, and my friend had already gone inside. I picked up whatever toys I had left behind, and just as I turned to start walking home, I noticed he was sitting in the parking lot of the court across from the main drive, sitting in his truck with the music off. I dropped whatever I was holding and go to pick it back up, and he's already directly across the street from me. "Hey, what's your name? Can we be friends? I feel really bad that I scare you. I'm a really nice guy once you get to know me." He had a tie-dye tank top on. His acne was very flared up and angry, and his hair was really greasy. I remember just being so repulsed by him. My legs locked up, and I was trying to decide if I had a better chance of escaping through the forest that surrounded the complex, or take a chance down the main drive. "I can't be friends with you. My mom said so." "Well, let me give you a free ice cream." "My mom says I can't have ice cream." "Okay, you can have a candy or soda, or what about a snap bracelet?" "Sorry, I can't cross the street." "That's okay. I'll come to you. You can ride in the truck and play with the music if you want to." I realized this back and forth was going to be a losing battle for me, so I decided the best thing to do was to play along. "Okay, if you turn the truck around, I don't have to cross the street so my mom won't get mad." He got way too excited that I seemed willing and began to drive. He would have to leave the complex and immediately re-enter it, but it would buy me about 30 seconds. I then took off running. I got home and my mom was on the phone with my dad, who was out of town for the day. I told her what happened and she made me tell my dad. Then they both said how proud they were of me and how I had made very grown-up decisions. After that, unless I was out of town, I avoided all ice cream trucks that came into our complex. I still think about this to this day, and I always tell this story to the kids I babysit. I just hope I was the only kid he tried to bait, and that nobody else had an experience with him that turned out much worse. Growing up in my neighborhood was sometimes difficult. Since it was below sea level, it flooded every year, which severely limited my ability to go anywhere. Unless the flood was actually in our yard, which was a rare occurrence, most of the kids from the neighborhood would normally wind up playing ball in our yard. Altogether, there were probably 10 to 8 kids, some of them from our neighborhood, which we called the bottom, and some from the surrounding neighborhoods. We would choose teams and play whatever game was popular at the time. When we moved away in November of 1984, it was a sad time for me, because I was leaving behind the only friends I had ever known, some of whom I've known since kindergarten. I was 15, and we relocated for several reasons. My father got a better job offer in another state. My mom went to school for cake decoration and wanted to start her own business in a bigger town. And our trailer home was starting to show its age. But I think the most important reason my parents decided to move was that the population of the bottom had grown. It attracted a less than perfect quality of resident, if you catch my drift. In the last few years that we lived there, the police were coming out more and more often. The bottom seemed to become a refuge for those who weren't on the best terms with law enforcement. There were more and more vehicles coming down our road, driving faster than what was safe at all hours of the night. It was rare on weekends that we didn't see red and blue lights whizzing past our house while hearing the blare of sirens. One night, a helicopter landed in the field across from our house and was met by an ambulance a few minutes later. We heard later on that someone had broken into a house and had been shot. It wasn't that tight-knit, small community it used to be any longer. The summer of '84 was eventful for me on several levels. I turned 15 in July, had got my first razor among other gifts, and my voice had finally stopped squeaking. I had grown to 5'10", and I was a cornerback in my high school football team. My dad was teaching me to work on cars by fixing up an old '83 Cougar. I would be driving it around once I got my license. And last but not least, I was in love with a girl who lived down the street from us. Her name was Heather, and she consumed my every thought. We had known each other since her family moved in about a year after us, and we had rode the bus together for almost 9 years. She was my first crush, kiss, love, heartbreak, my first everything. Heather was a year younger than me, and we went from hating each other in elementary school to tolerating each other in junior high. When I began high school, she was still going to junior high, so we would take different buses. I remember the first day I noticed her as something other than a skinny, dark-haired girl from down the street was when school started after Christmas vacation, and she got on the bus wearing a new pair of glasses. Weird, I know, but those glasses seemed to magnify her pretty green eyes in a way that I had never seen before. She caught me staring at her as she walked by to sit with her friends, and smiled at me. Braces. Wow. By the time she started high school the next year, we were a serious item. Her mom and my mom were good friends, and her mother would always say something that would embarrass me. "You two will have the cutest kids." or, "Oh, I think I hear wedding bells." Of course, she was teasing, but still. Every time we left her house to go for a walk, do homework, or whatever, her dad gave me the sternest look and would say, "Be nice." I knew exactly what he meant, and I was always nice, for the most part. Heather had diabetes, and it always amazed me how she had to get shots every day. Every single day. I was in awe at her bravery and just how she shrugged it off as a part of life. She broke her ankle one summer jumping from a horse who had gotten spooked. So every afternoon, I would ride the bus past my house and carry her books in for her, and then I would walk home. Her mom always invited me to stay for dinner, but I never did. About a week after she broke her ankle, we came home from school one day, and there was a new trailer house in the lot next to hers. Her mom told us that she had already met the family, and they had a boy who was around my age, and another son who was around 8 or 9. I met them a few days later when they started riding the school bus. Robert was actually a year younger than Heather. He was a tall, gangly, clumsy type of kid who wore a thick pair of glasses and was really into Dungeons and Dragons. He was quiet and kept to himself. We invited him to play football and do other stuff with us, but he was never interested. He read a lot and stayed indoors. Heather had already told me that he watched her whenever she was outside, but every time she waved, he would act like he didn't see her. Despite that, he was an okay guy. He taught me how to play D&D and another game that I can't quite remember now. His younger brother Jason was a different story. Jason was an odd duck, especially for his age. His head was too big for his body, and his teeth and ears were also disproportionate for his head. He was mouthy too. Anything or anyone that had ever seen or done anything, he or someone he knew had done it better. It got so bad that he would actually make up words about things to see if we would take the bait. He knew all about the Chevrolet Z56 12-cylinder, which was a car with 6 wheels coming out the following year. It would be one of the most desired models of 1985. He knew all about the new bullets the Army had developed that could spot someone around corners and shoot through tanks. Ha! The damn Reds are going to be shaking in their boots now. One day, Heather caught him behind their well house. He was bent over and had his back turned. She asked what he was doing, but he didn't respond, so she walked over to see. He had found a dead bird and was pulling the feathers and skin off of it, like some kind of fucking psychopath. Heather said that she screamed and asked, "What on earth are you doing?" She told me that he never moved and just looked over his shoulder with a creepy smile. "I want the skull." About a month later, Heather's father caught him inside the well house, putting wrenches into his pockets. He grabbed Jason by the arm and took him over to his house to make him admit to his mother that he was stealing. When Jason's mother opened the door and saw that her son was being held by the arm, she went crazy and started yelling at Heather's father, telling him that she was going to sue him. As Heather was telling me all this at our kitchen table, her dad walked by and said that Jason was a creepy little bastard. About a week or so later, Robert showed up at my house and asked if I had seen Jason. He was supposed to be home for dinner, and it was almost dark. I hadn't seen Jason, and I relayed that to Robert. However, my mother overheard Robert asking me and told him that she had seen Jason over in the field across the road. She said that he was playing with a dog in the door of the old abandoned barn. Robert and Jason missed school the next 2 or 3 days. The next time I saw Robert on the bus, he told me that he found Jason in the barn. Jason had killed the dog, and there was blood everywhere, all over him, like he had been playing in it. Robert said he ran home, leaving Jason there, and told his dad about it. They went back to the barn and Jason was still inside. Robert said his father grabbed Jason and was dragging him out of the barn when he saw a pile of skulls. He told me that there were animal skulls of all different kinds on the shelf. He didn't recognize a lot of them, but he could tell that one was a bird and another was a mouse. He said that there were bigger skulls there too, probably 15 or 20, and they were all in varying states of decay, and some still had skin left on them. Flies were everywhere, and the smell was almost unbearable. Of course, I went straight to that old barn after school, but somebody had taken them all away. There was still a horrible stench in the air, and I saw that somebody had spread sawdust all over the floor. Robert told me that his parents had a huge fight the night they found Jason in the barn. Robert's father was planning on taking Jason to a doctor, but his mother kept insisting that he was just a boy, doing normal boy things. Jason wasn't on the bus for 3 or 4 weeks after that. When he did go back to school, he wasn't the same person. He did not speak to anyone, and he didn't respond when he was spoken to. Obviously, everyone had 1,000,001 questions, but he just ignored them all. He just stared out the window with his mouth open, never saying a word. Looking back now, he must have been on medication, but at the time, I didn't know that. Eventually, the attempts to get his attention turned to ear flicks and swats to the back of his head, but there was never a response. Then, one afternoon, we were riding the bus and approaching our stop when Jason began hitting himself. Nobody noticed at first, until a kid named Bobby turned around in his seat and told Robert that his brother was hitting himself in the face and that he was getting blood all over his clothes. Robert got up and sat next to Jason, holding his wrists together so he would stop. That was the last time I saw Jason before I moved 2 months later. Once we were at our new place, I called Heather as soon as we set up our phone. We had already said our goodbyes but promised to keep in touch. Heather and I would exchange letters and cards mostly. This was before cell phones, and long-distance charges were too much, so I was limited to 1 hour of phone time on the weekends. Heather told me the most important news through the letters whenever she didn't want to be overheard telling me any gossip that was juicy. This is also how I found out that she had gone on a date with someone else. Anyways, Heather told me about how Jason was back in school and how he would get into a fight at least once a week. She said that he was talking now, but only when someone spoke to him, and it was only a one-word response. He always had a scowl on his face and walked around with his hands clenched into fists. She said that someone visited his house on Tuesdays and Thursdays and stayed for about 3 hours before leaving. Sometimes she would hear Jason screaming at whoever it was. It seemed that as time went on, his behavior was becoming more bizarre. He was up all hours of the night, standing by his window and looking outside for hours. Heather also told me that she thought Jason's mother was on drugs. Evidently, she had spoken to Heather and kept calling her Stephanie one time and then Sandra another time. Over the next few years, Heather and I continued to keep in touch. She told me about her prom and even sent pictures. By this time, I had met somebody else, and I wasn't so bothered about Heather seeing other people. Actually, I was jealous, but I never said so. I graduated high school in 1986. She graduated a year later, and then had a wedding announcement the following year, in 1988. That one hit me pretty hard, but by then, I was able to genuinely be happy for her. However, the wedding never happened. I got engaged myself about 6 months after that, and I joined the army 2 months later. We still sent letters and cards several times a year. Occasionally there would be something about Jason. He stole a bunch of stuff from cars that were parked by our old house, After the floods came one summer, someone saw him going from car to car and called the police. He broke all the windows out of our neighbor's house while they were gone for the weekend. He got caught shooting a pellet gun at someone's horses once, and he was also accused of assaulting a girl, but nothing ever came of it. In December of 1990, my unit was dispatched to Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm. I sent Heather my APO address, and I told her about how my fiancé had left me the previous month. She told me to be careful, and that she was afraid for me, and to promise that I would write her as often as I could, which I did. I received a letter from her in May of 1991. We were still overseas and had no clue when we would be heading home. When I opened the letter, there was also a newspaper clipping. It was an article about a 15-year-old boy who had shot his neighbor in an attempted robbery and was being charged with murder. The name of the youth was being withheld because of his age, but it stated the name of the victim, Valerie. At first I thought Heather had sent the clipping because we both knew Valerie. She lived 2 houses down from me. She was a very nice, bubbly woman. She had a huge Great Dane named Ronto. She was one of those people who never seemed to be in a bad mood or had anything negative to say about anyone else. She was one of those people who made the world a better place just by being in it. Then I realized something, and my heart stopped. There was only one person I could think of who would be responsible for this. After reading the clipping, I read the letter. Heather told me that she hoped that I was okay and would be coming home soon. Then she got into what happened. Evidently, Jason got involved with some of the rougher people who lived in the bottom and started using drugs. He had been in some more trouble here and there, and it had gotten worse since his mom left earlier that year. Robert had gotten married and moved to another town. He came back to visit one night, and he and Jason got into a huge fight. Heather was able to hear everything because it was cool out that night, and she had opened up her window for some fresh air. She went on to say that she had heard them fighting and crashing into the walls and breaking things. She told me that one of them had gotten pushed into a window and broke it. At one point, Jason screamed so loud, his voice cracked. After about 15 minutes of this, things got quiet, and Robert left. Heather said that she could hear Jason crying and ranting. She then saw him in front of her house, heading toward Valerie's place. Valerie's husband worked at a grocery store during the day and went to college at night. He was also in the National Guard and was gone a lot during the summers. Whenever he was gone, Valerie's niece would stay with her. Jason was in love with her niece. I can't remember her name now, and I never knew her when I lived there. Heather told me that she didn't give it much thought because she was trying to concentrate on her studies, but when she heard shouting and saw Jason running back to his house, she just assumed that Valerie had told him to get lost, especially if he was on drugs or something. Heather went back to her studies and forgot all about it until she heard shouting again about a half an hour later. She turned off her desk lamp so she could see outside better, and when she looked, the front door of Valerie's house was standing open. She was just about to call the police when she heard a shot and then saw Jason run out of the door heading back to his house. It scared her so bad she couldn't move. She sat in the dark, watching and listening, but was too afraid to draw attention to herself by moving or making any noise. Jason was home for about 15 minutes before he got into his dad's car and left. Once he was out of sight, she ran over to Valerie's house. The neighbor who lived between Heather and Valerie was already there and had already called the police. Valerie's niece was sitting on the sofa with her legs pulled up to her chest, hugging her knees. She was hysterical and crying. Mr. Votal, the neighbor, wouldn't let Heather go into the bedroom and said, "Keep the door closed You don't want to see what's on the other side." He then told her to sit with a girl, and they waited until the authorities arrived. Heather went on to say that according to the niece's statement, Jason asked if he could come inside and hang out. Valerie didn't think that was a good idea. The niece said that his nose and lip were bleeding, and he had cuts and scratches on one of his arms. He was asked to leave, and when he refused, she threatened to call the police. That's when he started shouting and left. The girl said that about 20 minutes later, something hit the side of the house, and Ronto started barking. When Valerie opened up the door, a man in a black ski mask forced her back inside with a pistol in her face. He made her lock the dog in the bathroom and threatened to shoot him if she didn't comply. When he talked, the niece recognized Jason's voice and the cuts on his arm. After the dog was put in the bathroom, he made them both go into the bedroom and lay face down on the bed. He wanted to know if they had any money, and Valerie told him that there was money in her purse. The niece said all was silent for about a minute, and then she heard the gun go off. Jason then ran out of the house. The police would find him a few hours later at a friend's, where he was arrested. He was later tried as an adult and sent to prison. I don't remember the length of his sentence, but as far as I know, he's still incarcerated. When I first met him as a kid, I always thought he would grow up to be a piece of shit. I had him pegged right from the start. There's this intrinsic intuition that people sometimes have, where you can tell the difference between bad behavior and a bad personality, even in children. If you're wondering about Heather and I, we eventually got married, but not to each other. Sorry if that disappoints. That's just how the chips fell. She got married to a man she had met in college, and they now live in Texas with 2 daughters. I'm married to a woman from Argentina, and I've been happy ever since. It's funny how sometimes life works out for the best, in spite of some bad times.